Hello class, good to see you again. Does this deck look familiar? Probably. That's because we'll be talking about the geography and early settlement of ancient civilizations. Except this time, instead of ancient Kush, Egypt, and Canaan, we'll be talking about the ancient civilizations of India. Early towns began to appear in India in about 2500 BCE. Over the next 2,000 years, a unique civilization developed. There's an ancient Indian story that talks about the early development. It goes like this. A river god and a river goddess once lived in the snow-covered Himalayas. One day, the two decided to race down the mountains to the plains below. The river goddess sped straight down and won the race. But her joy soon turned to worry. Where was the river god? The river god had slowed down to admire the snow-capped mountains and the rich brown plains in the valleys. In time, he flowed down to meet his goddess. The two rivers became one, joined forever on India's plains. The rivers made the land good for farming. We're going to be talking about these two rivers in detail as we go through this unit. Nice story, wasn't it? Before we get started, let's check out our essential question. Make sure you have your note paper ready and pencil in hand. Our essential question: how did geography affect early settlement in India? We just spent a lot of time discussing the geography of ancient Egypt, Kush, and Canaan. So as we go through this unit, I want you to think about the similarities and differences between India and those ancient civilizations. Okay, did you write your essential question down? Great, let's get started. We are going to be exploring 8 key physical features of the Indian subcontinent. All of its physical features influenced where ancient India's civilizations arose. An important fact to note is that when historians talk about ancient India, they are referring to the entire subcontinent, not just present-day India. That term should sound familiar based on the Socrative we did last week. So, the subcontinent consists of present-day countries such as Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, Pakistan, and the island nation of Sri Lanka. But what is a subcontinent anyway? Subcontinent is a large mass of land that is part of a continent, but because of its size and geographical features, it can be considered an independent entity. So in the case of India, the subcontinent is separated from the continent of Asia by 2 important mountain ranges, which we will discuss in detail shortly. The subcontinent is separated into 3 regions. Yep, I said regions, one of our 5 themes of geography. It has the northern mountains, the Indo-Gangetic Plain, which comes from the word Indus River and Ganges River, as well as the Deccan Plateau. Alright, so let's take a look at that on a map. Here we have the Indian subcontinent. As I mentioned, other present-day countries such as Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka make up the Indian subcontinent. If you look closely at the map, you can see the 3 regions I just mentioned. First, we have the northern mountain range. That includes the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush. Time out for a bonus question. The tallest mountain in the world is part of the Himalayan mountain range. I want you to tell me what is the name and height of this mountain. Also, if you can find out who the first person was to climb to the top successfully and what year, you'll get bonus points. Alright, time back in. So, we already talked about the northern plains. Then we have the Indo-Gangetic Plain. This is the second region of the subcontinent. This includes the Indus River Valley, as well as the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers. We're going to be talking about those a lot in a bit. Finally, you can see the Deccan Plateau. This plateau sits on the southern tip of the subcontinent between 2 mountain chains, the Eastern and Western Ghats. As you can see, the continent is a peninsula because it's surrounded by water on 3 sides. By having the mountains to the north and the water on the 3 sides, the early settlements of India were isolated from other civilizations. So this caused a very unique civilization to develop with their own special culture. But before we talk about the culture of India, let's talk about the 3 environmental factors of the subcontinent in detail. First of all, what are the 3 environmental factors of an area? You should know this answer. Water, topography, and vegetation. Give yourself a High five if you got all three. Alright, so water is the most important environmental factor. Let's talk about the three main rivers of India. India was very fortunate to have a lot of sources of good water. The first being the Brahmaputra River. This river begins in the Himalayan mountain range and flows 1,100 miles through the northern part of the subcontinent through Bangladesh. It becomes slower and deeper as it flows into the valley. Every summer it receives additional water from the heavy rains of the monsoons. Because of the heavy rains, it floods and overflows onto the banks, similar to the Nile, developing fertile land on its banks. And as I mentioned in the story earlier, it joins the Ganges, which makes for a very fertile area where they meet. That makes it an important feature for farming, trade, and transportation. The river is also an important feature to the religion of Hinduism. Hindus believe that the river represents one of its main gods, Vishnu. So both the river and the god are considered preservers of life. Here we have a quick view of the river, which is along the northern part up here on the east. This is also the god Vishnu, preservers. Okay, so why are monsoons so important to India, and what are they anyway? India has two major seasons. It has a summer season, which is hot and very wet, and a winter season, which is cool and very dry. The climate is caused by the monsoons, which are strong seasonal winds that often bring huge amounts of rain. In the summer, winds come from the Indian Ocean and bring large amounts of rain onto the land. In the winter, the winds come from the land, which keeps things dry. Let's take a look at that on the map. So you can see here we have our summer winds coming off the ocean onto the land, which brings the water. In the winter, we have winds coming from the land, keeping things dry. So there are both benefits as well as disadvantages of these monsoons. One benefit is that it brings much needed water for farming. So having the monsoons is key for survival in many parts of the Indian subcontinent. However, the monsoons can bring heavy rains that cause flooding and cyclones, which makes for significant damage. Villages and farms are destroyed almost every year because of the overflowing rivers, and the violent storms cause great devastation. So now that we know about monsoons, let's talk about our next main source of water, the Ganges River. The Ganges River flows across most of northern India. Like the Brahmaputra, it starts in the Himalayas and flows about 1,500 miles directly through the Indo-Gangetic Plain. The river makes its way south through the ice, rocks, and magnificent mountains and valleys, and as it flows, it carries silt from the Himalayas to the northern plains, leaving rich sediment behind. As a result, the northern plains contain some of the most fertile land in the world. As I mentioned earlier, the area where the Ganges meets the Indus River is called the Indo-Gangetic Plain. This is the most fertile area on the subcontinent. Accordingly, most of the ancient civilizations settled in this area because the land was so good for farming. However, while the melted ice carried down the Himalayas provided the plains with a good supply of water, the river would flood and destroy crops planted on its banks every rainy season. So, as we just discussed, the monsoons enabled great farming, however, also brought great destruction each year. The Ganges River is also known as the Gangamai, or Mother Ganges, because it's important to farming, trade, and transportation. The Ganges is also important to the Hindu religion. It's actually the holiest river in the religion. And the Hindus believe that they must purify themselves in it, so they drink and bathe and wash to carry their sins away. Here are a few pictures of the river. The Ganges is along here, and you can see people bathing in the river, washing themselves of their sins. Finally, we have the Indus River. The Indus River also begins in the Himalayas, but this flows northwestern through Pakistan. The melting snow and ice from the mountains keeps the river's water level high. Eventually, the river flows through present-day Pakistan and empties into the Arabian Sea. Pakistan used to be part of India, remember I mentioned that earlier, but split in 1948. We're going to discuss this later when we learn about the government of India. The Indus River Valley contains some of the best farmland in the world. Like the Ganges, the Indus River carries silt from the mountains to the plains. The silt leaves the surrounding soil rich and fertile. For this reason, the Indus River has often been compared to Egypt's Nile River. Like the Nile, the Indus River is an important source of water for farmland along its banks. Because of the fertile lands, this is where most civilizations of India started, specifically the Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa civilizations. And this area is still important today. India and Pakistan are actually fighting a lot over this area because there's lots of fertile cotton fields. So as you can see here, the Indus River Valley flows in this area from the Himalayas south to the Arabian Sea. And here are some pictures of artifacts from the Mohenjo-Daro and Harappan civilizations.